Hi, welcome to our next segment in our unit related to Asian art. In this video, we're going to be looking at religious architecture in India and Cambodia. So this is our first image that we're going to be looking at. So think about it. Can a mound of dirt represent the Buddha, the path to enlightenment, a mountain, and the universe all at the same time? It can if it's a stupa. So this is what you're looking at right now. The stupa, which is Sanskrit for heap, like a heap of stuff, or maybe a mound of stuff, is an important form of Buddhist architecture, though it predates Buddhism. You kind of want to think of a stupa as almost like a reliquary monument, which is a place of burial or receptacle for religious objects. At its simplest, a stupa is a dirt burial mound faced with stone. In Buddhism, the earliest stupas contained portions of the Buddha's ashes, and as a result, the stupa began to be associated with the body of the Buddha. Adding the Buddha's ashes to the mound of dirt activated it with the energy of the Buddha himself. So before Buddhism, great teachers were buried in mounds. Some were cremated, but sometimes they were buried in a seated meditative position. The mound of earth covered them up. Thus, the dome shape of the stupa came to represent a person seated in meditation, much as the Buddha was when he achieved enlightenment and knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. The base of the stupa represents his crossed legs as he sat in a meditative pose called Padmasana, or the lotus position. The middle portion is the Buddha's body, and the top of the mound, where a pole rises from the apex, surrounded by a small fence, represents his head. Before images of the human Buddha were created, reliefs often depicted practitioners demonstrating devotion to a stupa. The ashes of the Buddha were buried in stupas built at locations associated with important events in the Buddha's life, including Lumbini, where he was born, Bodh Gaya, where he achieved enlightenment, and Deer Park at Sarnath, where he preached his first sermon sharing the Four Noble Truths, also called the Dharma or the Law, and Kushingara, where he died. The choice of these sites and others were based on both real and legendary events. And again, that's a practice that we see among other ancient cultures in relation to sacred sites. According to a legend, King Ashoka, who was the first king to embrace Buddhism, he ruled over most of India, or the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent from 269 to 232 BCE, created 84,000 stupas and divided the Buddha's ashes among them all. While this is an exaggeration, and the stupas were built by Akasha some 250 years after the Buddha's death, it is clear that Ashoka was responsible for building many stupas all over northern India and the other territories under the Mauryan dynasty in areas known as Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. One of Ashoka's goals was to provide new converts with the tools to help with their new faith. In this, Ashoka was following the directions of the Buddha, who prior to his death, Parinirvana, directed that stupas should be erected in places other than those associated with key moments of his life, so that the hearts of many shall be, quote, the hearts of many shall be made calm and glad. Ashoka also built stupas in regions where the people might have difficulty reaching the stupa that contained the Buddha's ashes. So he's trying to make it very convenient for people who wanted to practice this faith. The practice of building stupas spread with the Buddhist doctrine to Nepal and Tibet, Bhutan, Thailand, Burma, China, and even the United States, where large Buddhist communities are centered. While stupas have changed in form over the years, their function remains essentially unchanged. Stupas remind the Buddhist practitioner of the Buddha and his teaching almost 2,500 years after his death. For Buddhists, building stupas also has a karmic benefit. Karma, a key component in both Hinduism and Buddhism, is the energy generated by a person's actions and the ethical consequences of those actions. Karma affects a person's next existence or rebirth. For example, in the Avadana Sutra, 10 merits of building a stupa are outlined. One states that if a practitioner builds a stupa, he or she will not be reborn in a remote location and will not suffer from extreme poverty. As a result, a vast number of stupas dot the countryside in Tibet, where they are called Khorten, and in Burma, Chedi, Chedi. And again, this is something we'll see when we look in Western art, especially with church building and the patrons of those churches. Often, especially when we get into in the Renaissance and in the Baroque era, we'll see that a lot of families would pay to have a church or a chapel built, and obviously this was designed so that they would have a better chance of getting into heaven. Buddhists visit stupas to perform rituals that help them to achieve one of the most important goals of Buddhism, to understand the Buddha's teachings known as the Four Noble Truths, also known as the Dharma and the Law. So when they die, they cease to be caught in samsara, the endless cycle of birth and death. So the Four Noble Truths are: 1, life is suffering, and suffering equals rebirth. 2, the cause of suffering is desire. 3, the cause of desire must be overcome. 4, when desire is overcome, there is no more suffering. Suffering equals rebirth. Once individuals come to fully understand the Four Noble Truths, they are able to achieve enlightenment or the complete knowledge of the Dharma. In fact, Buddha means the enlightened one, and it is the knowledge that the Buddha gained on his way to achieving enlightenment that Buddhist practitioners seek on their own journey toward enlightenment. So what you're looking at is one of the most famous stupas, the Great Stupa. This was built at the birthplace of Ashoka's wife, Devi, daughter of a local merchant, in the village of Sanchi, located on an important trade route in the state of Madhya Pradesh in India. Oops, sorry. And so what we'll learn too is that in addition to Buddhism, we still will see some figures, especially when we look on this sort of gate or right here entryway, that do relate back to Hinduism. And we'll talk about those later. Here's another view of the Great Stupa at Sanji. One of the earlier sutras, a collection of sayings attributed to the Buddha forming a religious text, records that the Buddha gave specific directions regarding the appropriate method of honoring his remains. The Maha-Parinibbana Sutra, and again, please, these correct spellings and pronunciations are in your lecture notes. His ashes were to be buried in a stupa at the crossing of the mythical four great roads, the four directions of space, the unmoving hub of the wheel, the place of enlightenment. If one thinks of the stupa as a circle or wheel, the unmoving center symbolizes enlightenment. Likewise, the practitioner achieves stillness and peace when the Buddha's Dharma is fully understood. Many stupas are placed on a square base, and the four sides represent the four directions: north, south, east, and west. Each side often has a gate in the center, which allows the practitioner to enter from any side. The gates are called Torana, Torana. Each gate also represents the four great life events of the Buddha. So east is Buddha's birth, south is enlightenment, west, the first sermon where he preached his teachings or dharma, and north, nirvana. The gates are turned at right angles to the axis mundi to indicate movement in the manner of the arms of a savastika, a directional symbol that in Sanskrit means to be good. Su means good, or auspicious. Asti means to be. So suasti, I pronounced it wrong. The Tarana, or directional gates, guiding the practitioner in the correct direction on the correct path to enlightenment, the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. So, an axis mundi is a theme that we'll see in other ancient cultures and religions, and it basically means the center of the world. So we'll often see structures that incorporate an axis mundi. You can think of it as a cosmic axis, a world axis, and basically, like many sacred structures, it's a connection between earth and heaven. Um, the real world versus the sort of supernatural world. So at the top of a stupa is something called a yasti. And I know this is bad. My slide is not very good, but this is the yasti right here, or a spiral which symbolizes the axis mundi, a line through the Earth's center around which the universe is thought to revolve. The yasti is surrounded by a harmika, a gate, this is it right here, or fence, and is topped by kshatras, umbrella-like objects symbolizing royalty and protection. So they're over here. The stupa makes visible something that is so large as to be unimaginable. The axis symbolizes the center of the cosmos, partitioning the world into 6 directions: north, south, east, west, the nadar, and the zenith. This axis, central axis, the axis mundi, is echoed in the same axis that bisects the human body. In this manner, the human body also functions as a microcosm of the universe. The spinal column is the axis that bisects Mount Meru, the sacred mountain at the center of the Buddhist world, and around which the world pivots. The aim of the practitioner is to climb the mountain of one's own mind, ascending stage by stage through the planes of increasing levels of enlightenment. And I'll give y'all a printout of this that is not pixelated. I apologize. Circumambulation. This is an important vocab. The practitioner does not enter the stupa. It is a solid object. Instead, the practitioner circumambulates. They walk around it as a meditational practice, focusing on the Buddha's teaching. This movement suggests the endless cycle of rebirth, or samsara, and the spokes of the enlightened, or the Eightfold Path. 8 guidelines that assist the practitioner that leads to the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths and into the center of the unmoving hub of the wheel, enlightenment. This walking meditation at a stupa enables the practitioner to visualize enlightenment as the movement from the perimeter of the stupa to the unmoving hub at the center, marked by the yasti. So it's very different, when we think of the way Catholics worship. It's a much different architecture construction. You enter a building, it's usually a very wide open space, and the practitioners actually pray and congregate within that structure. So one of the things that we'll be doing is sort of comparing and contrasting various sacred spaces, how the worship utilizes them, and just sort of compare and contrast those themes. The practitioner can walk to circumambulate the stupa or move around it through a series of prostrations, a movement that brings the practitioner's body down low to the ground in a position of submission. An energetic and circular movement around the stupa raises the body's temperature. Practitioners do this to mimic the heat of the fire that cremated the Buddha's body, a process that burned away the burned away the bonds of selfhood and attachment to the mundane or ordinary world. Attachments to the earthly realm are considered obstacles in the path toward enlightenment. Circumambulation is not veneration for the relics themselves, a distinction sometimes lost on the novice practitioners. The Buddha did not want to be revered as a god, but he wanted his ashes in the stupa to serve as a reminder of the Four Noble Truths. So again, here's a diagram of the stupa, and it's an elevation as well as a floor plan. So getting back to the stupa of Sanchi, there are many, many, many stupas, but this is probably one of the most famous ones. And I wanted to give a little bit more attention to one of the gates, or the Toranas, and this is the East Torana. And so again, the Great Stupa of Sanche is the finest example of monumental architecture of Shunga, of the Shunga era, which was from 185 to 75 BC. It consists of a large hemispherical dome, which was built over an already existing stupa ascribed to the 3rd century BC from the time of the Buddhist emperor Ashoka Maurya, who reigned, we talked about him, he reigned from 269 to 232 BC. The stupa was later enlarged around the 1st century BC under the Shungas, and 4 elaborately carved gateways or Toranas were added at the cardinal points. The eastern gateway consists of 2 square posts crowned with a group of 4 elephants and 2 shalaba anyaka, which are these female figures. You see a detail grasping the branch of a tree. These support a triple architrave with scrolled ends and carved figures of winged lions, peacocks, and elephants. The gateway is completely covered with sculptures depicting various episodes of the life of the Buddha Shakyamuni, and these are represented symbolically. The sculptures are on the top architrave depict the 7 Manushi Buddhas, the previous Buddhas. The middle architrave shows the great departure of Buddha from his place at Kalpilvastu. Again, I'm sorry with these pronunciations. While the lower architrave depicts the royal visit of Ashoka to the Bodhi tree under which Buddha attained enlightenment. So again, I wanted to focus on these figures of the women, the Shala Bahangika figures, because this is also sort of a transition from Hinduism to Buddhism, and so we see kind of some of the iconography and symbols kind of mix or intertwined, because a lot of converts to Buddhism were Hindu. And so this is a sculpture of a woman. She's displayed stylized, very feminine features, standing near a tree grasping at the branch. The name of these figures come from the Sanskrit word, which I can't pronounce, meaning breaking a branch of a solid tree. They are also known as Madanaki, and they're also considered a fertility emblem. And they're in this expressed pose, or a type of pose called a yakshi, which is something that we do see in Hinduism and depictions of figures in Hindu art, who raises her arm to grasp the branch of a tree while her opposite leg is cocked on the ball of one foot. Early belief in India held that a woman could make a tree fruitful by grasping its branches in this way. Sometimes the yakshi holds a cross-legged instead of a cocked leg posture, and sometimes the figure is male instead of female. Technically, the term Shaba Hanyaka should be used only for one who grasps the shal tree in this way. different terms being used for those who grasp other kinds of trees, lotus buds, vines, etc. But this Yakshi, I'm going to call her just a kind of a Yakshi figure, um, is kind of a way to kind of help converts up to Buddhism who might have been Hinduism, sort of, to make it more familiar with them and to sort of um, kind of entice them in that way. And that's probably not a good word I'm using, entice, but obviously sort of incorporating some of their iconography to so that Buddhism is more approachable for them. All right, so small stupas, which you're looking at here, can function as a votive offering. So they're not just, large architectural, stupas, but they can also be kind of small sort of relics. Um, and a votive is a votive object is one that serves as the focal point for acts of devotion. In order to gain merit to improve one's karma, individuals could sponsor the casting of a votive stupa. Indian and Tibetan stupas typically have inscriptions that state this, that the stupa was made, quote, so that all beings may attain enlightenment. Votive stupas can be consecrated and used in home altars or utilized in monastic shrines. Since they are small, they can be easily transported. Votive stupas, along with small statues of the Buddha and other Buddhist deities, were carried across Nepal over the Himalayas and into Tibet, helping to spread Buddhist doctrine. Votive stupas are often carved from stone or cast in bronze. The bronze stupas can also serve as a reliquary and ashes of for a reliquary for the ashes of important teachers that can be encased inside. The stupa clearly shows that the link between the form of the stupa and the body of the Buddha. The Buddha is represented at the moment of enlightenment when he receives the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, or the Dharma or law. He's making the earth-touching gesture, and this is the figure here that we see, this little relief of the Buddha, the earth-touching gesture, or mudra, and is seated in Padamasan, in the lotus position. So this is typical sort of iconography that we see when of depictions of Buddha. He is seated in a gateway, signifying a sacred space that recalls the gates on the east side of monumental stupas. Um, so let me see if I can enlarge. Oh, let me see if there you can get a better image of that. I'm going to stop here. In our next segment, we'll be looking at a Hindu temple. So stay tuned.